So probably if you found your way to this course, you have some understanding of what ChatGPT is and what it can do. It is a service completely freely available on the OpenAI website, where you basically get to chat with an AI or artificial intelligence model. And you can ask it to do many things for you. For instance, you can ask it to give you a recipe of a traditional Italian pizza, but with ingredients from every single continent. Or you could ask it to write an upside-down fairy tale. Or to write you a sales pitch for a certain course on using AI to create websites that you might be working on. Or, and this is what we will focus on in this course, you could ask it to give you the code for a complete website. A website for a bakery, for instance. So ChatGPT is obviously very powerful, but what is ChatGPT? So for this course I want to stress that it is not important to really understand how ChatGPT works. We will be able to use it just as well regardless. But let me quickly give you a rough overview of how it works in case you are interested. So ChatGPT is the latest installment of OpenAI's large language models. These models are trained using large sets of text from the internet. So what is a language model? Often the goals of language models is to predict the next word in a sentence using previously seen data. Two types of techniques are used in most language models: next token prediction and masked language modeling. As the name suggests, the first predicts the next word in a sequence, and the other masks a word and tries to predict the masked word. Both these methods are utilized to give the model a sense of how text is structured. These techniques in the training makes the model learn to write fluent natural text. ChatGPT and earlier GPT models use varieties of these techniques in an unsupervised fashion, and this means that it's learning without any training labels, so without any human giving it meaning about what it's learning, and instead it tries to figure out the overall patterns in the data. The output to these operations are so-called embeddings, which are no more than computer interpretable numerical representations of the sentences that allow for sequence or sentence prediction. In the next step, these embeddings are fed into a transformer. Transformers are the backbone of the GPT models and enhance the model's contextual understanding by introducing an attention mechanism. With attention, it is meant that the model can focus on specific parts of the input and with that make contextual relations. However, this leaves out an important step on how we humans communicate. We as humans also integrate background and situational knowledge together with so-called common sense to construct the best response in the given moment. So the model has to learn a way to give meaning to each sentence in order to give a proper response. To increase the model's grip on the meaning of a given sentence, a human in the loop approach is required. A human is introduced to the system using a technique called reinforcement learning from human feedback, or RLHF. The introduction of this step is the secret to ChatGPT's success in conversing with humans. How this works in practice is that human evaluators will look at the chatbot's outputs and give a ranking on how helpful the output is, how truthful, and finally how harmless it is. This ranking has the purpose of training a reward model, which in turn helps in training the entire model on which outputs are desired and which are not. Especially the evaluation of the harm of the outputs really lowered the ability of ChatGPT, as many requests can be stamped as inappropriate or harmful and will thus not be answered. ChatGPT is also biased, as any such system will always be. First, the data on which it is trained will always contain some bias, and the human evaluators, though trying to be objective and trying to counteract the bias of the training data, they will also always introduce some bias to the system. So that is important to keep in mind when using ChatGPT. So the model is a language model, which implies that it excels in creating written content. It is currently not capable of making visual or audio content, but there are other AIs that can actually do that, such as DALL-E for images. And you can imagine how powerful something like ChatGPT will be in the future when it incorporates all those types of media in its output. Some more practical notes on ChatGPT. So ChatGPT is not connected to the internet, and it is only trained on data from before 2021, and it can thus not answer any questions related to things that happened after that. Furthermore, ChatGPT has the capability to remember past questions and conversation pieces in order to make the conversation more natural. This memory is not endless, however, and it is not as potent as human memory. It stores about 6,000 characters in a conversation. And before I forget, you can go to ChatGPT by going to openai.com. And right here at the top of the OpenAI website, you can hit try, which might ask you to log into your Google account if you haven't already. And then ChatGPT will open for you. Alright, so that's it for the introduction to ChatGPT. In the next lesson, we will give a basic introduction of HTML and CSS code. But for now, I will leave you with a quote from ChatGPT itself. The future of language models is limitless. The only thing holding us back is our imagination. ChatGPT. See you in the next lesson. Alright guys, welcome to the next lesson. In this one, we will go over the basics of HTML and CSS code, both of which you need to code a website. So before we go into HTML and CSS, as mentioned in the start of this course, one of the problems this course wants to address is that now anybody has the power to generate code, but where do you put this code to have it actually work? So to write the code for a website, you need an interpreter or integrated development environment or IDE. An IDE translates human readable code into machine readable code. So that's basically zeros and ones. And it thus is the interface between what you write and the computer. There are many softwares available that can do this, but our favorite and the one we will use in this course is Visual Studio Code. This is a free, widely used and highly flexible IDE or code editor, perfect for getting started in web design. The examples you will see on screen as we explain HTML and CSS will all be written in Visual Studio Code, and in the next lesson after this one, we will also guide you through downloading and setting up Visual Studio Code for yourself. So in web design, there are multiple different types of code, and these are hierarchically related to each other. The bottom fundamental layer of code is HTML. This provides the structure of the website. The next layer is CSS. CSS describes the appearance or presentation of the HTML elements. And finally, the top layer is JavaScript, which is used to control the behavior of or interaction with the different elements. So JavaScript is used if you want to include movement or calculations or interaction on your website. We will look into JavaScript in a future lesson, since we can create a basic website without using JavaScript and only using HTML and CSS. Let's first look at HTML. HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language. It is not a programming language, but more like a structure language. The language describes the structure of the web page by means of HTML tags. Here you can see an example of what an HTML code for a website looks like. By the way, I had ChatGPT write this code for me. So as you can see, everything is built up using these tags that are in between the smaller than and larger than signs. These tags show the browser in which way the information should be displayed. As you can see, the tags have a beginning and an end, and in between the beginning and the end of a tag, the content of that tag is written. There are also tags which only have one part, such as the image tag. The tags might all seem quite random right now, but there actually is a hierarchy to them. And once you understand this, it will be quite easy to see which tag refers to which element of the web page. So let's look at the hierarchy of HTML. So at the top of the hierarchy is the doctype HTML tag, which lets the browser know that this is an HTML document and should be interpreted as such. This tag does not have an end that goes with it. Next there is the HTML tag, which is called the root node because all of the HTML code of that page is written within that tag. End tags always have a / after the smaller than sign, as you can see here. Then there are two different tags, the head tag and the body tag. Only the information that is written inside the body tag is rendered and displayed to the web page. The head tag only serves the purpose of giving more information to the browser on, for example, the type of language that is used. And this information in the head tag is called metadata. Metadata is not displayed on the web page, but provides context for the browser on how the browser can interpret the content of the web page. The head tag also contains the title tag, displaying the title of the web page. Don't be mistaken by this tag because it does not show up inside your web page. The place where this title is presented is in the tab bar of the browser, as you can see here. Now, all the actual content of the website is placed in the body tag. As you can see here in the example web page, there's also a hierarchy in the body tag as well. First off, there are multiple parts of the body. Most often there is a header, some sort of navigation, the main section, and the footer. And within the main section, often there are separate sections contained in the section tag or the division tag. In these sections, you can then place the actual content such as titles, paragraphs, images, videos, contact forms, etc. There are two ways to display an element in HTML: inline and block. The block elements always start on a new line of code and always stretch the full page, and a small margin is added above and underneath the block element. Examples of these block elements are the paragraph and division tag. This is an example of a block element in HTML code and how it is then displayed on the web page. And these are all the block elements in HTML. Next we have the inline element. This element only takes up the space that is necessary to display its content and thus does not need to start on a new line. So this is an example of an inline element. And these are all the inline elements in HTML. You certainly don't need to know any of these by heart, but this is just to give you an idea of what is out there. You can also always look up any tag on the internet. There are many good websites such as W3 Schools, and we will put a link to this in the description of this lesson. Alright, so now we have a good basic understanding of HTML code. There are a couple more things we will say about HTML, such as IDs and classes, but before we mention those, let's first look at CSS code. So now let's look at the CSS code. CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheet. As mentioned before, CSS code describes the appearance or presentation of the HTML elements. Every HTML element can have its own piece of CSS code, and if an HTML element does not have an associated piece of CSS code, it will get the default style. This is what a website without CSS looks like. This is of course quite ugly, so we do want to link CSS code to the HTML elements. And there are three ways to do this. You can write CSS code inline, which means that within a tag, you can use the style attribute and write your CSS code right there in the tag that will then apply to the content of that tag. You can also write CSS code internal, meaning that you place all the CSS code in the head tag of the HTML file. To do this, you use the style tag and place the CSS in between it. With both of these two options, you have the CSS code in the HTML file. But for the third option, you create a separate CSS file, also called a style sheet, where you place all the CSS code. This is the nicest option of the three, since placing the CSS code in the HTML file can become quite messy, and it is nice to keep them separate. If you create a separate CSS file, you need to make sure this is linked to the HTML file. We will look into how to do this in future lessons, but here you can see an example of how this is done in the head tag. Next, just like HTML code works hierarchically, so does CSS code. Another way to describe this idea of the hierarchy is that there are parent-child relationships. The head and the body in the HTML are children to the HTML root node, and in this example, the H2 title and the paragraph are children to the section tag, and the section tags are children to the main tag, and in turn the main tag, the header, the navigation, and the footer are children to the body tag. Cascading in CSS stands for the fact that CSS makes use of this hierarchy such that when a style is applied to a parent element, all the children of that element will have the same style, unless a different style is specified for any of those child elements. Alright, so now you have a good idea of what CSS code is used for and where you can put it. But what is the actual CSS code? CSS code is made up out of rules and consists of selectors and declarations. The selector is the reference to the HTML element you want that piece of CSS code to apply to. So if you put a parent element in the selector, that code will apply to the children of that parent as well. In HTML, as I mentioned before, there are also classes and IDs that you can apply to the elements, as you can see here. These are very useful to refer to in the selectors of your CSS code. When you want to select a class to style, you need to write a dot and then the class name as selector name, followed by the declaration. If you want to select an ID name, you can write a hashtag and then the ID name as selector, as you can see here. Next we have the declarations. The declarations are how the selector is styled. Declarations are further subdivided into property and value. The property is the aspect of the selector you want to style, for instance the color, and the value is the specification of what you want the property to be, for instance blue. The CSS file will basically just be a large list of selectors with their declarations. Some important properties most HTML elements have are the padding, border, and margin. These can be used to manipulate the layout of how the website looks and to space everything out nicely. The padding is the space between the actual content of the element, for instance the text of a paragraph element, and the border around the paragraph element. The margin is the space between the border of the element and any other element on the web page. It is good to know the difference between the padding and the margin to quickly solve layout problems and to be able to ask ChatGPT precisely what you want it to do. So that is it for the theoretical explanations for now. In the next lesson we are going to download and set up Visual Studio Code and actually start using ChatGPT to write our website for us. See you in that lesson. Alright, so to download Visual Studio, first we simply go to Google and type in Visual Studio. Then we click the first link that brings us to a Microsoft website. And then at the top center of that website, it says Free Visual Studio. Once you click that, you see 3 options and we need to get the right one that says Visual Studio Code. And if you click the drop down, you can simply select the operating system you want to use. So for me, it's going to be Windows, and that's going to download Visual Studios. And once it's done, simply click it to start the installing process. And then once you're done installing it, Visual Studio will automatically launch. Alright, so there we are in Visual Studio. Now Visual Studio always works with folders. So first we need to make the folder on the top left. If we hit File and click Open Folder. Now we're going to select a location that's easy for us to reach on our desktop, and we're going to create a folder that all our Visual Studio files are going to be located in. So I'm going to name my file Visual Studio Code. And then we're going to double click that one and we're going to create another folder for this specific project that we are going to start now. And I'm simply going to call that my first website. So now let's click that folder that we just created last and let's click select folder. And this is going to ask us if we trust this file, which we do because we just created it ourselves. So let's hit trust it and continue. And now on the top left, you can see this folder that we just created. But there's nothing in there yet. But there are 4 options on the right, and the first is to create a new file. So we are now going to create our first file within Visual Studio. And if you create a file in Visual Studio, it's very important to tell it what kind of file we are going to make. So now for the first file, the first simple file we're going to make, we're just going to make a plain HTML file. So whatever name you choose here, make sure you end it with .html. So I'm just going to call mine home.html because this is going to be the home page. Alright, so now that we've created a home for our code, we can now start creating the actual code. So let's go to ChatGPT and let's ask him to write us a website. So I'm going to type in, write me the HTML code for a basic website. And let's see what it gives us. Alright, so it immediately starts writing code, which is nice. Alright, so from this code you should already be able to recognize some features of what it's generating. So you can see there is a header with a title called My Website, and then it looks like it created below that a little menu of 3 items, and then it also created a little text for the website. And then what's really nice is below that, it creates a full description of what it actually did. So it tells you what code you need to start the document. It tells you to write in between the HTML tags. It tells you about the head and the body. So honestly, we could have just skipped our introduction to HTML section and just had ChatGPT explain it to you. But for now, let's just copy this code and put it right into the document we just created in Visual Studio. Alright, so let's paste the code. And now what we really want to do is just see what this looks like immediately. So if we go to the top left here and we right click the home.html file we just created, it should say open in browser. But as you can see, that option is not there. And that's because we need to download an extension or install an extension so that we can immediately see the effects of the code we are producing here. So it's actually really easy to install this extension. If you go to this left bar here, you can see one of these icons says extension. So we can just click that and then in the search bar type open in browser. And then typically this will be the top suggestion, but make sure that it has over 7 million downloads so you know it's the right one. And you can just click install. And as you can see, this will install very quickly. And now we can simply go back to the bar on the left and now hit the top icon to go back to our folder. And now if we right click this home.html document, all the way at the bottom it says open in default browser or open in other browser, and now we just want to open it in the default browser. And as you can see, this opened Chrome for us, but there's no code here, there's no text, there's nothing. And that is because we forgot one step. So we pasted the code in Visual Studio, but as you can see at the top right of the tab, there is this white dot, and that means that we haven't saved it yet. So if you go to the top left and click save, or just press Ctrl S or Command S on MacBook, then this is actually saved and Visual Studio actually knows what this code is and can actually process the code. So then if we right mouse click on home.html and we go all the way down to open in default browser, as you can see now it actually ran the code and processed it, and we can see what our beautiful website actually looks like. But now let's go back to ChatGPT and actually create something a little bit more interesting.